Hey there, wire weaver. Welcome to part 2 of my Wirework Basic Skills workshop. In part 1 of this series, we made the textured horseshoe frames for our earrings. Today we're going to concentrate on the beaded tassels that are featured in these earrings. To make these tassels, we'll use some simple loops, some wrapped loops, some pretty mobius rosettes, and I'll show you the secret to getting earring components to hang straight. My name is Wendy, and I'm the wire weaver behind door 44. If you want to learn to make wire jewelry, this channel's for you. These tassels are made of several components. So you can see we have a mobius rosette here made with 3 jump rings, and my last video showed you exactly how to make jump rings from scratch and how to make these rosettes. So I'm going to go ahead and link to that video right up here in the upper right hand corner. And also don't forget that there's a free download for a jump ring tutorial. So I show you how to make jump rings from scratch using just wire and a mandrel and a pair of wire cutters. So go ahead and grab that tutorial if you haven't already. You'll find that at door44studios.com/107. And also watch that video if you need to know how to make these mobius rosettes. Now we're going to weave this rosette as we connect it to this connector right here. Notice this double wrap on this wrap loop connector. I did that for a very specific reason. That's so that these tassels will hang straight. Oftentimes if you just do a single wrap on a connector and you hang something on it like a mobius rosette, it's going to want to twist and it's not going to hang straight with the decorative part of the rosette showing in front. And that's what we want. We want that nice straight tassel there so that when this hangs, that's always showing and it doesn't twist around like this. But the challenge with this style of connector with a double loop like this is that you can't get it onto a pre-made rosette. So we're actually going to weave the rosette onto this connector. So this is going to be the first thing that we make, this double loop connector here, and then we will weave our rosette onto that, and then we're going to add these pretty beaded dangles, which are what sort of add all the color to our tassel earrings. So let's go ahead and get started with that. I've cut 16 lengths of 22 gauge wire to 3 inches in length, and that's because we're going to need 8 of these per earring, so that we have the 5 beaded dangles, and then we have the 3 wrapped loop connectors. I chose 22 gauge wire for this. You can also use 20 gauge wire if that's what you have on hand, or if you'd like your earrings to be a little bit bolder. These were made using 20 gauge wire for the dangles, and then I used 20 gauge jump rings here. These are pre-made, they're machine-made jump rings. And this earring design came about back, at the tail end of my chain weaving days when I was, starting to experiment more with jewelry wire and playing around with different ideas, kind of moving away from chainmail. So this is all hand-woven chain here, and I've just updated these earrings. I modified the frame a little bit. I add the curled loops, and rather than using the hand-woven chain, I opted to use beaded wrap loop connectors instead. Now the reason I chose 22 gauge in this case is these earrings, I wanted to lighten them up a little bit. These are a little heavy, and part of that is because of the chain, but it also, this 20 gauge wire is going to add some weight to these earrings. So these earrings are just heavy enough that they're not super comfortable for me to wear all day. If I wear them for more than 7 or 8 hours, they start to get a little uncomfortable and I end up taking them off. But these earrings are significantly lighter just because I used lighter weight wire. So keep that in mind whenever you're making earrings. Weight makes a big difference, and you'll be surprised at the difference in weight that you'll feel between 22 gauge and 20 gauge wire. So I'm going to go ahead and use 22 gauge, and like I say, I cut 16 pieces. That's enough pieces for all of my beaded dangles and my wrap loop connectors. And we're going to go ahead and start with the double wrapped loop connectors. So I'm going to take 2 of my wires, and I want to grab a hold of those about maybe 1.25 inches, because I'm not quite in the center of that. And I'm just going to put a little bit of a bend there. And notice I'm doing these 2 wires together because I want to make them very consistent. So that's not a real sharp angle. It's not much. You want just a bit of an angle there. And then we're going to grab our step to loop, or our step to bill making pliers. we need to be able to feed the Mobius rosette through there, so we're going to go ahead and use this 3mm step. So I'm just going to position my pliers right on that bend, and then I'm going to wrap all the way around 2 times. So you may have to adjust your pliers when you do this. And then we're just going to take this tail, and I'm going to go ahead and hang on to this with my, just gently hang on to it with your pliers and start wrapping that around there. Now, this tail was a little short. I probably should have added a little bit more wire there, but that's okay. We're just gonna, I like to make 3 wraps on my wrap loop connectors. I may not get 3 out of this. Looks like I'm gonna get just 2. But that's okay. Go ahead and just wrap those on there nice and tightly. So there's our double wrap loop, and that's what's gonna help that Mobius rosette hang straight. Just that little extra bit of width keeps it from twisting on that loop. So we're going to go ahead and make the second double wrap loop. So again, I'm gripping with my 2mm step on the bottom, and I'm wrapping tightly around that 3mm step. I'm going twice all the way around. See that? See if I can get that to focus. There we go. So that's what it'll look like on your pliers. And let's see if this will be a little bit easier to wrap while it's on the pliers. So now I'm just going to bring that tail not necessarily easier. This tail's a little bit too short, so should probably do about 1.5 inches. I think I underestimated that, the length of wire I would need to make this double wrap. And I'm bad about measuring wires for this kind of thing. I usually just eyeball it, which also works, but sometimes you end up a little short like we did on this case. I would rather have 3 wraps on that loop. That's usually what I'm going for, is a nice even number or odd number of wraps. So 3 wraps per loop is what I like to get, but this will do. So there's our double wrapped loop, and that's going to help that Mobius rosette hang nice and straight. So now we're ready to go ahead and make those Mobius rosettes. Now I'm going to go pretty quickly here. I demonstrated how to make the Mobius rosettes in the video that I mentioned earlier. So I show you how to make jump rings from scratch, how to open and close jump rings, and then how to weave these Mobius rosettes. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to loop 1 ring through my double loop connector, and then I'm going to close that ring. So 1, 2, 3, and close. See how I did that? And now this is where it gets a little, where you have to start paying attention to the direction that you went through the loop. So I'm going to go through the double loop, and then I'm going to go through that first loop that I put on there. See how I did that? So one end of that tail is going through the double loop and then through the closed loop that's on the ring. And we're going to close that again. So 1, 2, 3, and close. And now you can see that our 2 rings fit together just like that. See how they're looped together? So now we're going to add our 3rd ring. Open that up a bit. And again, I'm going to go through the double loop and through both rings this time. And you may have to fiddle with this a little bit. Get that through there. And there we go. So those rings, see how they're all laying next to each other? That's what we want to see. And now I can close this ring. So 1, 2, 3, and close. All right, so now when our rings hang, see how it just nests nice and neatly together? That's what we want. And notice also that it hangs very straight on that loop. Let me adjust this camera here so you can see it from that front angle. See how nice and straight that hangs? It doesn't twist. That stability comes from that double wrap on that loop. If we did just a single wrap, this rosette would be wanting to twist and it wouldn't hang nice and straight. So that is the secret to getting things to hang straight. And you can see that I did that also on this original pair, only I used double jump rings here. So there's 2 jump rings around that rosette, and that's what keeps that hanging nice and straight. So just a little insider tip for you there. If you ever have trouble with something that's not hanging straight on a pendant or earrings, try using a double loop or a double jump ring, and that's just going to add some extra stability for you there. So again, we're going to go through our double loop. I'm going to close the first ring, 1, 2, 3, and close. And remember that motion that we're doing, we're adding tension, so our rings close nice and neatly and tightly. See how tight that joint is? You can barely see that connection because it's nice and snug. And then I'm going to go through the double loop and through that first closed jump ring. And again, I'm going to close this ring. 1, 2, 3, and close. And now these rings nest neatly together. So one more time, we're going to go through the double loop and through both of our jump rings. One, 2, 3, and close. And again, if you closed all your rings properly, they should all sort of line up in kind of a spiral. You want them all going in the same direction so that when we hang this loop now, they're just going to nest nice and neatly together. See that? All right, so that's step 1 for our beaded tassels, and we're just going to go ahead and finish these loops off. We'll finish our connector. So to do that, you're going to need 2 of your 3mm beads, whatever beads you're using for your earrings. I'm going to make these earrings very colorful. I've made 1 pair of colorful earrings and 2 pairs that are a little more muted and neutral, and these are going to be another very colorful pair. So I'm using some 3mm fire polish check glass beads. These are matte. They have a matte finish and they have a little bit of an AB finish on them. These are really pretty beads. I like them a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and add a bead onto each of my wrap loop connectors. And then I'm going to grab the top of that connector with my chain nose pliers. So I like to have 3 wraps on my connectors, but this one I only got 2 on those first, the double loop. So I'm going to just shoot for 2 wraps on this so I have an even number of wraps and my connector looks nice and symmetrical. So you want to, in order to get these wraps to work out properly, you want to grab just above the bead with your chain nose pliers and kind of pick a point that feels like it's going to be about the width of 2 wraps. So if I look here, that's about right there. So that's kind of where I want to position my pliers. And then I'm just going to tip that wire back just a smidge. So kind of like we did when we started this connector. Not a sharp, super sharp angle, just a little bit of a bend. And then for this one, I'm going to make just a 2mm loop. I don't want a big loop. I want this to be fairly small, because we're going to have 3 loops that join at the top and attach to our ear wire. So I don't want those loops to be too big because I just kind of want them to not draw attention to themselves. So we'll just make a 2mm loop. And again, I'm just going to bring this around and tightly bend it around that 2mm mandrel. And I'm going to go all the way until I've crossed that center point. See that? And then at this point you can just grab on with your chain nose pliers, just gently hold that loop, don't hold too tight. And we're going to tightly wrap this tail end around the shaft, and we want 2 wraps, which looks like we're going to get just 2 wraps there. That worked out perfectly. And once you've got your wrap done, you can just snip off that wire, your tail, get in there as close to the point where you want your tail to end as possible, and snip that off. And then I always go back in with my chain nose pliers and I tuck in that cut point just to make sure everything's tucked in and there's no sharp points sticking out anywhere. So you can see our connector is done now. We have our rosette, and there's 2 loops on each side of the, or 2 wraps on each side of the bead. And notice also that these looped ends are in line with each other. So this is something when you're making wrap loop connectors, you sort of have to plan and think about what the final assembly is going to look like. So let me show you a couple of differences here. Now in the original earrings that I made, I was going to show you a different technique. I was going to, can you see how these 2 side connectors are actually connected to this center connector, the single loop there, and then the ear wire is connected to that loop as well. That's the way I originally planned to demonstrate this technique. And in order to do that, we want these loops going in opposite directions. So we want this one facing forward so that the rosette hangs facing forward. But we want this one rotated 90 degrees so that the ear wire can attach to it and the earring will hang straight on the ear wire. This is my preferred way to assemble wrap loop connectors, but as I was trying to demonstrate this, it got to be just a little bit complicated to teach. It gets kind of tricky using wrap loop connectors and connecting them together in this way. You end up having to manipulate things quite a bit. It gets a little hairy you know, trying to get everything connected, the last connection in place, because things want to twist. And I just decided it was going to be a little bit too complicated to try to demonstrate, because so much depends on that initial bend or the initial loop that you make. So it depends on, you know, which side of the shaft that your tail comes out on. If it's on the right or the left, it's going to change the way that you approach assembling these connectors together. The thing I like about this particular assembly is this is super secure. This earring is not going to fall apart. There's virtually no chance of it falling apart because everything is bound with wrap loops. Everything's connected together. So it's an extremely secure method of putting things together. But it comes at a price. It is a little bit more complicated to do that type of assembly. So for this beginner's workshop, I decided to modify the design just a little bit. So instead of connecting everything to this top loop of this connector, this one right here, I decided to make a different style of ear wire than I typically use. And this ear wire just uses a simple loop. So we're just going to make all three of these connectors, and then we'll use that simple loop to tie them all together at the top. And this also gives us an opportunity to add another accent bead, so we can match our ear wires to the earrings. So like on this one here, this is my basic French hook style ear wire, and there's a free tutorial for this available on my blog. I will link to that in the description. This is my favorite ear wire to use on most things, but notice that the loop hangs in line with the ear wire, so you don't really see the loop from the front. On this one, I had to modify that. So this has the loop visible from the front, and it also allows me to place an accent bead there. And this is more of the kind of style that you'll see on commercial ear wires. This looks like a lot of commercial ear wires. So we'll make these here at the end of this tutorial. But this is just for beginners. This is just a little bit easier assembly method. That other method that I use, that's going to be more of an advanced technique that I'll show in another video down the road, because it does get a little hairy putting all these woven connectors together. The advantage of that, of course, is that added security. So these are the kind of things you need to think about while you're working with wrap loop connectors. You need to decide, do these loops need to be in line with one another, or do they need to be perpendicular to one another? So think about that as you're using them. If you're making something like a rosary chain, you're going to want to alternate these loops on every link. So you would have one, you know, facing forward, and then you'd have this side of the loop facing the other way. So, and what that does when you're weaving rosary chain or something like that, it helps minimize kinking. If you keep all your loops going the same direction like this, your chain's going to be more prone to getting kinks in it than it will if you alternate the loop position. But in this case, we want this loop facing the same direction as the double loop. So we're going to go ahead and complete that loop on this connector. So once again, I'm going to position my pliers where it's about 2 wraps thick. Create my little bend. Create my 2mm loop. Now the one thing when you're using wrap loops like this, be consistent in how you make them. So if you put the tail, you saw when I brought that tail around, I brought it to the right side of the shaft on the first one. I want to do that on the second one as well. And actually on all of my wrap loops that I make. That consistency really just is sort of a nice finishing touch on your jewelry. People don't really necessarily even notice it. So they may not be aware of that detail consciously, but it's there, and people do get a sense of things. You know, when you hear somebody say, oh, well, that jewelry is really well made, sometimes people can't really put their finger on that. They don't know what they mean exactly by it's well made. But a lot of times what they're referring to is it's made consistently, and it's, you know, with attention to detail. And that's what we're aiming for. So again, we got 2 wraps and 2 wraps. Now if you look on the back of this, I ended up with 3 wraps on the back. And that's okay. But again, this is something I want to keep in mind. I'm going to want to have this side facing forward because I want that detail to be visible from the front. It just looks more finished. It looks more well thought out. And these are the kinds of details that are so important in jewelry making. And I think a lot of people miss that. I see a lot of really creative designers out there, and they do some fabulous designs, but they're not great technicians, and their attention to detail is not great. And so, you know, a lot of really beautiful designs aren't very well executed, and it makes a big difference. And it's, you know, it's something you want to think about. So keep that in mind as you're making your jewelry. Be consistent. Keep everything nice and neat and tidy. You know, be consistent in your approach. Try to get the same number of wraps on everything. Try to get the same number of, or the same size loops on things. Those little details will make a world of difference in your jewelry. The next thing we're going to do is prepare our beaded dangles for our tassel. These are 3-inch pieces of 22 gauge wire, and I've positioned all of these so that the flush cut is all on one end, because that's the end where I want to make my simple loop for the end of my drop. Now this is not strictly necessary, it's just something that I like to do because I feel like it gives you a neater finish on your simple loops and your drops. We're just going to make some very simple loops. We're not even going to be, you know, super careful about getting them perfectly round, and then we're going to hammer them just a bit. So they end up looking like sort of pretty little teardrops at the bottom of these dangles. I really like that look a lot, and I find that having the flush cut end helps keep those a little bit cleaner and neater. Now the other thing you're going to need is a pair of round nose pliers that have a little bit of a thicker tip. So if you look at these are my Swanstrom round nose pliers, and you can see those tips are very, very small. Those are too small. I don't want to use these to make these drops. So I'm going to use my old round nose pliers, which have a little bit more of a thicker tip. And as you can see, if you look closely at these, one tip is just slightly smaller than the other, this one here. And this is the one that I like to use to make things like head pins. So we're going to go ahead and start making these head pins, and I'm just going to grab my wires, and one at a time I'm going to grip my wire right at the tip of my round nose pliers, and that tip of the wire is flush with the jaws of the pliers, and I'm just going to roll that around all the way until I have what looks like a little bit of a P shape. And then I'm just going to put my round nose tip back in there, and to center this I'm just going to tip this shaft back just a bit, and you can see that opens the loop just a little bit. So I'm just going to go back in there, use my round nose pliers again, and I'm going to gently squeeze that loop closed. So that's what my finished loop looks like. And having that nice flush cut end gives me a nice tight closure on that simple loop. Now again, we're going to hammer these, and that's going to open a little bit, but we're just going to close them right back up. And I think, you know, again, just having this flush cut when you hammer, it gives you a little bit cleaner edge. You don't end up with any, you know, sharp, pointy edges kind of sticking up out of your simple loop. You just want this to be very clean, and you want it tightly closed, just like that. So I'm going to go ahead and continue. I've got 10 of these to do. There's 5 per earring. And these loops, like I say, they're very simple. They're not you know, this isn't a difficult head pin to make. They're quick and easy to make, actually, and that's one of the things I like about them. But I also think they're attractive. They're a nice alternative to making ball ends, or, you know, putting a lot of time and effort into making elaborate shaped head pins, or, you know, enameled head pins. There are so many different things you can do with head pins, and a lot of them, you know, there's a lot of really fun designs to do, but I like to keep things super simple. And again, these earrings have sort of a rustic feel to them, so I want them to look very handmade. I don't want them to look like they were manufactured. So we're not going for perfection here. We want, you know, clearly handmade but well made components. So we keep everything very consistent in size, and we aim for, you know, nicely closed loops and straight pins. But we're just not going to put a lot of time or effort into really worrying about absolutely every minute detail. These are a fun earring that you can put together quickly. So if you need a quick gift for, you know, last minute gifts, you know, good for clearing out your bead stash. If you've got just a lot of small quantities of different kinds of beads, you can definitely use these earrings to clear that out. That's one of the things that I'm really trying to do this year. I've made the decision to stop selling finished jewelry, so one of the things I'm working to do is to use the beads and gemstones that I already have on hand and get some of my stash cleared out and declutter a little bit. Okay, so there's all of our head pins. They all have nice little drop-shaped loops on the end, and these are just simple loops. But look how pretty they are. They sort of look like little water drops or something, and I just think they add a nice little touch to these beaded dangles. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to bring back our bench block, and we're just going to very lightly hammer each of these head pins. We don't want a huge spread. We don't want to flatten them too much. We just want to flatten them just a little bit, and they're going to open on you a little bit, so we'll get in there with some pliers again. I'm going to use flat nose pliers this time because it's a little easier to squeeze these shut than with round nose. And we're just going to squeeze that shut so we have that nice closed simple loop. Easy peasy. These are super quick and easy to make, but they're, like I say, they're a really versatile head pin. You don't have to get too elaborate with head pins. They don't, I mean, they add a little bit of extra detail. You do see them, so in that regard, it's nice to add some detail there. But like I say, you don't have to go crazy with them. I think a lot of people, you know, spend a little time, too much time worrying about what their head pins look like. And the truth of the matter is, once you get the beads on there, the head pins are not that noticeable. And even like this one here, this one is not perfectly shaped. You can see it's not quite as round as some of the others. And that's okay. It's going to be fine. So you can see I'm just doing 3 light taps per head pin to get these hardened, and, you know, to add a little bit of something about flattening them. Just makes them look more refined or more, I say, you know, handcrafted. If you leave the wire round, oftentimes they end up looking a little bit like manufactured head pins, and we don't want that. So we want to make sure that, you know, they look as handmade as the rest of the components in our earrings. And this is the last one. And there we go. Now we're getting to the fun part. You're going to need some beads for these earrings, and I'll give you the sizes that I'm using. These are 8 by 6 millimeter check glass fire polish drops. You'll need 2 of those, 1 for each earring. These are 6 millimeter check glass fire polished rounds, and you'll need 2 per earring again. Let's separate these out. And then these are 3 millimeter fire polished check glass beads, and you're going to need 10 per earring. I should say 9 to 10. So we're going to use 9 in the beaded tassels and in the wrap loop connectors, and then we'll use 1 bead for our ear wires if you decide to make these ear wires. If you're using commercial ear wires, or you already have some different ear wires you want to use on these earrings, then of course you won't need that 10th bead. So this is where you get to have a lot of fun and make these earrings really your own. We're just going to stack these beads and sort of play with them a bit and come up with a configuration that we like, and I've already come up with a bead pattern that I like a lot. So in my center tassel, I use 2 3 millimeter beads and a drop, and then just to the right and left of that, I'll use 1 3 millimeter bead and 1 6 millimeter bead. Then we're going to use just a single 3 millimeter on the outer edges. And this gives you a pretty colorful beaded tassel without being too overwhelming or too heavy. You want to be careful about adding too many beads to your earrings, because the weight will add up fairly quickly, and these earrings can very quickly become a little bit heavy and uncomfortable to wear. So keep that in mind as you come up with your bead combinations. But go ahead and sort through your stash. Like I say, these earrings make really great stash busters. They're a lot of fun to put together. I've come up with some, 4 different color combinations as I've been working on this tutorial, and I love all 4 combinations. I think this one might be my favorite. They're so colorful and bright. Great for summer. And then of course the prototype, the first pair that I did, used these same teal colored check glass beads with green drops and orange crackle glass drook beads. And these are really pretty. And then this is a more neutral color combination, sort of some creams and champagnes. These are really pretty. I think these are going to be great. I'm probably going to wear these quite a lot in the winter. I tend to wear a lot more neutrals in the winter. And then these are sort of a fall version with some greens and browns and oranges. Now that we've prepped all of our head pins to make our beaded dangles, we're going to do something a little bit different. Now, ordinarily on a wrap loop connector, we would use our chain nose pliers to grip just above the bead so that we'd have about 3 wraps on that shaft. But we're going to do these a little bit different. We want to add a little bit of texture and interest to these tassels, and we also want to lengthen them just a little bit. So instead of using my chain nose pliers, I'm going to use my flat nose pliers. And I'm going to grip that head pin just above the bead. So notice my bead, there's no slack here in my bead. I've got a nice tight fit. It's tight up against that loop, and I'm grasping with just the tip of my pliers, and I'm going to go ahead and create that bend. So now we have a longer neck on this pin, which means we're going to get more wraps on there. So I'm just going to go ahead and make that same bend on all of these, and while I'm doing this, I'm positioning this loop facing forward because I want to see that in the finished earring. So these loops are going to be going in the opposite direction of that. They're going to be going around this way. You're not going to see the loop part. You're just going to see the front of that loop as it goes around the Mobius rosette. but we want these open loops to be facing out. So always pay attention whenever you're making head pins or whenever you're making wrap loop connectors. Always pay attention to the position of your first loop and decide, do you want your loops facing the same direction or do you want them perpendicular to one another? And in this case, we want them perpendicular. And again, this goes back to those, paying attention to the details. It's these little details that will set your jewelry apart from other handmade jewelry in the market. And this is particularly important if you're a seller, if you are wanting to start your own handmade jewelry business, or you already have a handmade jewelry business. Finishing touches, I just cannot stress enough how important these details are. And customers do notice. I've had so many customers comment on the details of my work. And I think, I'm a detail person. I notice details. I always have. I've always been, deep in the weeds looking at the details. My husband is a photographer and he likes to take landscapes. So he does a lot of, distance photography and he likes to look at the big picture. I'll be the one in the weeds taking pictures of water drops on leaves. So we have two totally different approaches to the world and two very different perspectives. It works for us. We complement each other well. But I am definitely the detail person in our relationship. So now that we have all of our pins prepped, we're going to go ahead and make the loop that's going to go around the Mobius rosette, and we're going to do that with this 3mm loop again, because we need that extra millimeter there of thickness on the inner diameter for these to hang freely on the Mobius rosette. So I'm going to just form that loop just like that, and I'm going to repeat that on all 10 of my dangles. Now this is another thing. I'm doing this in sort of a production type workflow, and that goes back to my days of making jewelry for sale and having a lot of jewelry to make. But the thing about this, taking everything one step at a time and repeating that step over and over, is that also is going to help with your consistency and improve the quality of your work. Because when you finish one thing all the way through and then you go back and start over, there can be some minor differences, just little subtle things that you don't notice when you're not repeating a step 10 times in a row. So repetition is key to getting things looking neat, consistent. I know it's sort of a regimented approach, and a lot of people don't like that. They feel that's too restrictive. But again, if you're selling jewelry, you need to come up with ways to be efficient, and doing a more regimented workflow will improve efficiencies in a lot of cases, and it also will improve the quality of your work. So think about what your priorities are. If you're just a hobbyist, you're just having fun, then you don't need to worry about this so much. But I know a lot of you are either, active sellers and growing handmade jewelry businesses, or you want to do that. So these are the things that have, the sort of systems that I've adopted through the years that have really helped make my jewelry consistently beautiful. And people know what to expect when they see my jewelry because of that consistency. All right, we've got all of our loops prepped, and now we are ready to start attaching them to our rosettes. So I'm going to start with this group here, and now we're just going to twist this open just like we would a jump ring. So just twist open, and I'm going to feed that through the front face of a rosette, and then I'm going to just squeeze that closed again, just like that. Now I'm not going to wrap these loops until everything is attached to the rosette, and that's so that I can make sure that everything is in the proper position. This is the front, and I'm going to go through the front of the rosette. Now this gets a little, you know, dicey because you've got wire sticking out at you all directions. But now notice that both of those tails are going the same way, so that means that both of these now are going to be wrapped in a counterclockwise manner. So again, we're going to go through the rosette, and once we twist that around, the tail comes out on the other side. And all three of our tails are pointing the same direction. So the tails are coming out the front of the rosette. And I'm saying the front, but I don't mean that this has to be the front when we hang it on the, we're gonna pick the side that looks best when we actually hang it on the earrings. But for the sake of putting together these tassels, I just want to make sure that everything is flowing in the same direction. So I'm being very careful to keep all of those wire tails coming out on the same side of the rosette. And I say it's the front because this is the side that I'm feeding the wire through as I begin that wrap. So I'm going through this direction, and then as I tighten that loop, the wire ends up coming out on that side. So now we have all 5 of our wires coming out one side of the rosette. And it's a little bit messy and kind of hard to work with at this point, but that's okay. We're just going to go ahead and start wrapping these now. So now that all my dangles are on there, I'm just going to grip with my chain nose pliers right at the point above where I'm going to begin that wrap. And now I'm just going to very carefully and slowly start twisting this tail around. And you want to do this carefully so that you get nice, tight, neat, even wraps. If you try to go too fast, you'll get some gaps and it just won't look very pretty. And remember, these wraps are adding texture to our tassel, so we want them to be nice and tight and even. And we're just going to keep on wrapping until we get to the top of the bead and we've got a nice tight fit. And then I can trim off that tail. And I'm going to get in there with my chain nose pliers and very carefully pinch that tail down so that nothing's sticking out. So let's see, we got about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6 wraps on that. So that's kind of what we're going for, is about 6 wraps per dangle. Let's start on the next one. Again, you're going to pinch that loop gently. You don't need to squeeze hard, you want to just hang on to it sort of firmly so it doesn't slip around on you while you're making those wraps. And then you're just going to carefully and tightly start twisting that wire around the shaft as many times as you can. Keep your wraps nice and close together. And just keep wrapping until you get to a point where your beads are nice and snug. And then you can trim off that tail. Get in there with your flush cutters. And gently pinch that tail end down. So there's 2. And we're working on our center dangle now. Same thing. Pinch the loop closed with your chain nose pliers. Carefully, slowly, evenly wrap that tail around your shaft. And trim. Tuck in that tail. And we have 2 more. So again, we're going to pinch and hold with our chain nose pliers. Get that tail nice and tight. And one thing that's a little bit harder to plan with these dangles is getting all of your ends, your cut ends, into positions where they're not visible. That is a little bit hit or miss with a design like this where you've got multiple dangles, and where you're making them, you know, you're putting them onto another component. If we were making all of these in advance, we could probably be a little bit more careful about that and, you know, really make sure that there were no cut ends visible in the finished earrings, you know, the front of the earrings. In this case, it's a little bit trickier to pull that off. And you can get really crazy with, you know, worrying about details. The fact of the matter is, a detail like that isn't really going to be that visible to the naked eye. One of the reasons that I'm so aware of details is because I photograph my jewelry with a macro lens, and that will show you absolutely every flaw. So you become acutely aware of details when you photograph a lot of jewelry. And that's one of the reasons that, you know, I've started coming to notice a lot of really good designers that, you know, I really admire them. They have such amazing creative minds. But some of them are a little sloppy when it comes to their techniques, and it shows in their finished work. And it certainly shows in their, you know, photographed work that they're plastering all over Instagram. So I think, you know, working in this industry and photographing a lot of jewelry, your eye becomes trained to see flaws that a lot of people wouldn't otherwise notice. But the advantage of that is you learn to pay attention to details in your own work, and you learn to really take your time and pay attention to those details, because not only does it look beautiful in your finished designs, but it's also very clear in finished pieces when people, you know, when people see your work in person up close. It's just going to be that much more fascinating to them because it is so carefully constructed. So there's our first tassel. I'm going to go ahead and make the next tassel, and then we will move on to our final assembly. That's it for today's lesson. Be sure to look for part 3 of this series because we're going to make some classic French hook ear wires from scratch, and then we'll complete the final assembly of the Lucky You wire wrapped earrings. If you have any questions about this tutorial series, drop them in the comments. Or better yet, join my private Facebook group, Wire Weaving with Wendy. I pop in there at least once a day to answer questions and share the latest happenings behind Door 44. To join today, go to door44studios.com/Wendy.